Britain signed the Anglo-French Naval Agreement in 1912. They agreed to protect the French coast from Germany by patrolling the North Sea, while France took over the work of policing the Mediterranean. The Royal Navy's plan was the same one that had served them well for 100 years. They were going to blockade the Germans into their own ports to prevent them from accessing the sea. Technology like mines and submarines had rendered the old techniques of close blockade impossible, so to start with, they planned to have their cruisers and destroyers patrolling a line midway through the North Sea. Towards the end of 1912, this changed to a distant blockade that was to be run out of Scottish waters. This would still keep the German fleet within the North Sea and stop them from gaining access to the open ocean, where they could interfere with Britain's own supply lines. This left the two fleets staring at each other from either end of the North Sea. During the early years of the war, the German High Seas Fleet had been getting stronger. In the first 5 months of the war, 4 new dreadnought battleships had been added: König, Große Kurfürst, Markgraf and Kronprinz Wilhelm. Contrary to what many naval officers might have thought before the war, the main emotion that they felt was not the excitement of the heat of battle, but a kind of weary boredom. One officer on HMS Neptune hoped that the High Seas Fleet would come out from behind their minefields simply to give him something to do. January the 23rd, 1915 had begun like any other day. Admiral Fisher was in bed with a heavy cold. Winston Churchill, then the First Lord of the Admiralty, went to his apartment and they talked for 2 hours before the First Lord returned to his own flat in the Admiralty. He had just sat down when there was a knock at the door. Arthur Wilson walked in with a gleam in his eyes. The Admiralty's listening stations had just intercepted a message that the High Seas Fleet was coming out, and they would be able to catch him off the Dogger Bank. During the course of the war, 20,000 German wireless messages passed through the hands of the British cryptographers based in Room 40 of the Admiralty. Without them, there would have not been any Battle of Dogger Bank nor the Battle of Jutland. The Admiralty knew all about the dry docking of Von der Tann and the dispatch of Scheer's dreadnoughts to the Baltic. They could read all of Admiral Ingenhole's encrypted wireless traffic, including a complete list of everybody that was due to go on the Dogger Bank raid. They knew that they would leave the Jade at twilight to return at dusk, and thanks to Room 40, the British Admiralty knew all about it. If the Germans had wanted to set up a similar capability, all they would have had to do was bribe the hall porter at the Caledonian Hotel, who could see the smoke rising from the funnels of the British battlecruisers based at Rosyth as they got ready to sail. He would have told them that the British warships were weighing anchor and heading south at the same time that Hipper's ships departed the Jade. If they'd wanted more information, then a few shillings for the mess caterer would probably have been enough to tell them roughly how long that they would have been out. Beatty's squadron steamed from Rosyth through the night with neither moon nor stars on deck. All was darkness and quiet, occasionally broken by the smothered curse as a sailor bumped into some unforeseen obstacle. They were heading for a rendezvous with Trewitte's flotilla, coming up from Harwich, 180 miles west of Heligoland and 30 miles north of the Dogger Bank. They met as the dawn was just starting to light the eastern horizon. Beatty, with 5 battlecruisers, was under strength that day. Queen Mary, with her 13.5-inch guns, had sailed from Portsmouth to dry dock. This was particularly bad for Beatty, as Queen Mary was considered the best gunnery ship in the fleet, although she still had an overwhelming advantage in firepower. Hipper's fleet included some smaller light cruisers and a destroyer escort. At its core were the battlecruisers Moltke, De Flinger and Seydlitz, and the armoured cruiser Blucher. These latter two had already taken part in raids on the British coast. Blucher was so big that she was the missing link in the evolution between the armoured cruiser and the battle cruiser. She had been the first German ship to test gyro-stabilised guns for greater accuracy, and she was the first to have a tripod mast fitted for a new optical rangefinder. At 7:05, just as dawn started to break the eastern horizon, HMS Aurora spotted 3 4-funnelled cruisers and 4 destroyers. Her captain, thinking this was probably HMS Arethusa, let himself get within 8,000 yards before giving the challenge. It wasn't Arethusa. It was the German ship Kolberg. They made a note in the British code and then opened fire. If the flash of gunfire hadn't alerted the rest of the fleet, then Aurora's wireless message claiming to be fighting the whole of Germany would. At 7:30, Goodenough's light cruisers saw dirty black columns of smoke rising into the sky. The German battle cruisers had been spotted, but so had the British. It did not take Hipper much time to decide what to do. At 7:35, he signalled his entire force to turn southeast and run for home at 20 knots. Goodenough turned to follow, and the chase was on. Trewitte's M-class destroyers raced ahead to get within 7,000 yards of Blucher, which brought down a storm of 8.2-inch and 5.9-inch shells on the destroyers, who had turned to get out of the way. Beatty decided that this was a job for his battle cruisers. On HMS New Zealand, the captain slipped off the bridge to a sea cabin. He returned wearing a green stone tiki and a black and white pew-pew skirt over his Navy uniform, which he had been promised would protect his ship if she ever went into battle. Down in the stokehold of HMS Indomitable, the furnaces were devouring coal as fast as they could feed them. The stokers looked like demons, armed with monstrous rakes and pickers, which sliced and tore at the molten fuel in their furnaces. But the men down there were as eager for the fight as anybody else on board. Indomitable had been designed to reach 25 knots. The stokers poured more fuel onto the flames. Her speed crept upwards. It reached 25 knots, but they kept shoveling and the speed kept going up. It kept going all the way beyond 26 knots. Beatty noticed and had a signal sent. "Well done, Indomitable." This was passed down to the stokers, but the engineering officer found it difficult to make himself heard above the sound of the men singing in time with the clang of their shovels. Thanks to the stokers' superhuman efforts, the British were gaining on the Germans as they raced back towards the Jade. By 0800, the range between Lion and Blucher was 25,000 yards, about 12.5 miles. This was only 3,000 yards more than the effective range of Lion's 13.5-inch guns. Slowly, the range decreased. At 8:52, Lion was close enough to fire a ranging shot at Blucher. At 9 o'clock, Tiger, close on Lion's heels, fired her own ranging shot. At 9:05, Beatty made a general signal to the squadron to open fire and engage the enemy. The British battle cruisers had left Rosyth in such a hurry that there was still a party of civilian electricians on board. Once it became obvious that they were going into battle, most of them offered to help where they could, except their foreman. He did not think that his union would approve. He continued to stroll about the upper deck until the guns started firing. Then he scuttled off to seek refuge in a 6-inch gun casement. Beatty wasn't going to hide. He was enjoying himself too much to seek the security of the conning tower. Instead, he, along with his flag lieutenant and flag commander and the secretary, stood on the open compass platform where they could get a better view of the action. Despite travelling at 27 knots and firing at a range of almost 20,000 miles, the British long-range guns began to score hits. This was despite only Tiger being fitted with direct firing. The British battle cruisers could outrange their German opponents. The 13.5-inch guns of Lion and Princess Royal at a range of 13.5 miles, with Tiger and Queen Mary able to reach even further. Von der Tann could only get to 22,300 yards, and Lutzow and Deflinger had even shorter range of 20,800 yards. As the range between the two squadrons closed, the Germans began firing back. Officers on Lion's bridge could see stabs of white flame coming from Blucher's guns ahead of her. Then, about 25 seconds later, a great column of water and spray erupted from the sea a little more than a mile off Lion's port bow. The Germans might not have been able to have the range of the British guns, but once they were within range, they had better accuracy. Inside his turret on HMS New Zealand, Prince George of Battenberg grumbled that his rangefinder was useless, and that he was getting soaked to the skin by the spray coming through the slit in the armour as he tried to use it. HMS Lion was soon being smothered in enemy fire. At 9:28, one of Blucher's 8-inch shells struck her in the port bow. It could not penetrate the turrets, but the charges of a turret ignited, and for a moment there was a danger that the entire ship would get blown sky high. One shell exploded in the forward superstructure of HMS Tiger, killing 5 men and a member of the Admiral's staff who had his quarters there. Lion was hit, and there was a terrific blow and shaking. The officer in charge of the fore transmitting station could hear the explosion just above his head and exclaimed, "That means either kingdom come or 10 days leave." Beatty's flag captain was enjoying the squadron's performance as much as his admiral. The rest of the admiral's staff would have also enjoyed staying on the signal bridge with them, but 2 were dispatched up to the small observation platform high up in the mainmast, 80 feet above the sea. The wind whipped at their clothes as they climbed up, and it was hard to grip onto the steel rungs of the ladders with shells exploding all around them. When they got there, they could barely stand up against the wind whistling through their lofty eyrie. At 9:35, HMS New Zealand had come into range of the Blucher and opened fire. Now only Indomitable remained out of action. With 4 ships against 4 ships, Beatty ordered each to engage their corresponding ship in the enemy's line. Lion was straddling Seydlitz at 17,000 yards. One of her 13.5-inch guns smashed into the armour of the foremost turrets. Charges being brought forward ignited in a great glowing mass of fire they could see from the Lion. The magazine crew, seared by flames, tried to flee forward by opening steel doors into the compartments of the adjacent turret, but the fire followed them. It spread into the adjacent magazine and upwards to sea turret. The crews of both turrets died as 6,000 kilograms of cordite burned away in just a few seconds, and the flames of their funeral pyre ignited both turrets as high as the mast. The ship was within seconds of exploding, but was saved by the actions of 3 men: Lieutenant Commander Hardim, Chief Artist Verhering, and gunner's mate Müller. They managed to make their way through the searing heat to the valve that flooded the magazines, drowning the threat of explosion in 600 tons of seawater. Both turrets were destroyed, but their quick action managed to save the ship. Beatty had 5 battlecruisers, Hipper had 3, and now one of them was heavily damaged. He needed assistance badly, so he sent out a call for help back to Wilhelmshaven. Admiral Ingenhol replied in an uncoded message, knowing that it would be picked up by the British. "Main fleet and flotillas will come." But he added a coded postscript: "As soon as possible." The British were also taking fire. Lion, at the front of the line, was taking most of it. An 11-inch shell from Seydlitz pierced her armoured at the waterline, flooding the main switchboard compartment. The ship began to list to port, but was still maintained a speed of 24 knots. Another shell exploded in the confined space of a turret lobby. It wrecked all the cabins there and reduced their contents to scattered ruins. Nobody was killed with that shot, but Lion was taking casualties. A man was sent down from the 6-inch casement, strapped inside a Neil Robinson stretcher. They opened it up and out rolled the foreman of the team of civilian electricians. He had been the one who had been worried about what his union would say if he helped out. Now he was cursing everybody and demanding that the captain stop the fighting so that he could get off. But other than that, he appeared completely fine. A quick shot of morphine put his mind at ease, and he was soon sleeping, while the battle continued to rage on around him. The British battlecruisers were slowly creeping up on the German line, with each one firing at Blucher as they got into range. At 10:35, 2 shells pierced her armoured deck. They sliced down through 2 more decks and exploded in the ammunition room. An inferno spread to her port-sized 8.2-inch guns, destroying them and killing their crews. The concussion also damaged her engine and her steering gear. Her speed had dropped to 17 knots and she sheered away from the German line. Beatty ordered Indomitable to chase her down. It was at this moment that Beatty claimed to have seen a submarine's periscope break the surface of his starboard bow. If he did, he was the only officer on Lyon's Bridge to see it. But the admiral worried that he was being led into a submarine trap, and would have suffered the same fate as the live bait squadron. These had been older, obsolete warships that were poorly protected against underwater explosions. Submarines would never be that successful against a battle fleet steaming in formation. They simply weren't fast enough. No first-rate capture ship on either side was sunk by a submarine during the First World War. When Fisher later heard about this, he didn't give Beatty any benefit of the doubt. Thanks to the efforts of Room 40, he knew the position of every German submarine in the North Sea, and there weren't any within 50 miles. But Beatty was not the only one making mistakes. His flag officer ordered his signalman to hoist flags that read, "Attack the rear enemy." Then he made a separate signal, "Course northeast." As the two signals were flying together and came down at the same time, everybody else read it as, "Attack the rear enemy steering to the northeast." This could only be interpreted one way. Beatty was ordering his entire squadron to go after Blucher. All four of the British battlecruisers behind Lyon peeled away to concentrate their fire on the old armoured cruiser. Beatty was now chasing Hipper's entire squadron on his own, but Lyon was in no state to take them on. She was listing to port with decks littered with fragments of smashed and twisted steel. Beatty realised that he was not going to be able to continue to command the battle from her. He ordered a small destroyer, HMS Attack, to take him to another ship from which he could command the battle. As they slowed, the stokers emerged from below and pressed around him, cheering. One sailor even did the unthinkable. He clapped him on the back, shouting, "Well done, David!" Beatty escaped as fast as he could. The ship's list let him step from the deck straight onto the forecastle of the smaller destroyer. He was followed by his flag lieutenant, carrying armfuls of flags and signal books. He left one signal flying behind on Lyon's cross streets, which read, "Keep nearer to the enemy." At 11:09, HMS Tiger, Royal Princess and New Zealand stopped firing at the battlecruisers and swung around to join the Indomitable in the final destruction of the already doomed cruiser Blucher. Commodore Truitt joined them in HMS Arethusa, accompanied by 4 M-class destroyers. The mass flotillas circled around their helpless prey, pouring fire into her. On board it seemed like one continuous explosion. The ship rocked as broadsides struck her. Her decks became a tangled mass of scrap iron, but 2 lone survivors in her one remaining gun continued to fight the 4 mighty battlecruisers. At 11:30, a salvo from HMS New Zealand hit Blucher in one of her most sensitive spots. A horizontal ammunition truck under the armoured deck used to supply the 2 forward broadside turrets. The British shell ignited 35 cartridges hanging in special ready service rail. They ignited and the fire ripped apart her most important systems. Her rudder gear, engine, telegraphs, fire control system. The sheet of flame leapt from Blucher's bow, but even that was not enough to kill her. She had been pounded by the battlecruisers for 3 hours. She was hit by 70 shells and 7 torpedoes, but she never gave up while she still had a gun capable of firing. It took 15 more minutes of hellish fire before Truitt signalled that he could not see Blucher's colours anymore, and everybody ceased fire. HMS Arethusa and her destroyers closed in to rescue any survivors. As they got closer, they saw the terrible damage that had been inflicted on her. In places, she was glowing red hot from the fires that raged within. At 7 minutes past noon, Blucher suddenly heeled over and plunged towards the depths. Arethusa and her destroyers lowered boats to try and pick up any survivors. Of Blucher's 1,200-man crew, only 234 could be saved. Just as Arethusa was trying to do her rescue work, a Zeppelin made an unwelcome appearance, and it started to drop bombs on her, forcing them to leave while there were still men in the water. By this time, Admiral Hipper's squadron was no more than smoke on the horizon, 12 to 15 miles away, and racing home at 25 knots. At 3:30, Hipper would link up with a high seas fleet, and that night he was anchored in the Jade River. Seydlitz, Der Flinge and Koenberg were still all heavily damaged. They had to pump 600 tons of water out of Seydlitz before they could even get her into dry dock. The battle cruisers formed up on HMS New Zealand and went looking for HMS Lion. They found Beatty in little HMS Attack coming towards them. He climbed up onto HMS Princess Royal, and at 12:33 he hoisted his flag to take back control of his squadron. But there was no more that he could do. At 12:45 he led them back to the crippled HMS Lion. The officers on board had black faces, torn clothes and jangled nerves, but out of the destruction the Admiral's steward had managed to salvage a case of champagne from the flooded storeroom, which they drank along with foie gras sandwiches. As they sailed beneath the Forth Bridge, heading back to Rosyth, they could see people lining its spans, cheering them as they came home. Lion had been damaged beyond Rosyth's ability to repair. She should have been sent to dry dock in Plymouth, but as Fisher was anxious not to allow anybody to see the extent of her damage, she went to Armstrong's shipyard in Newcastle upon Tyne instead. Dogger Bank was a British victory, but it was not a total annihilation that the Royal Navy or the public had so eagerly desired. Fisher was furious. For the second time, Room 40 had told his admirals exactly where to find the enemy, and both times they had disappointed him. Despite the phenomenal amount of punishment they had taken, the Germans managed to get home, even Seydlitz, although it had been badly damaged. Dogger Bank had given the Germans a bloody nose and made them profoundly depressed, but they learned the important lesson from this encounter about the danger of flash fires. They changed their regulations about how ammunition was carried, and with flash-proof doors being improved. The British did not gain the same experience. They just hoped that there would be a second chance, which the Germans could not run away from. They would get more than they bargained for when the next clash came at the Battle of Jutland. Well, if you'd like to listen about my series on the Battle of Jutland, then please like and subscribe, and the algorithm might tell you. If not, then thank you for listening this long.